Hello everyone, today we talk about the Polish-Lithuanian territorial growth towards the Black Sea into Ruthenia during essentially the later Middle Ages. I plan on expanding a bit more, especially on early modern Eastern European history, and this video is propedeutic to that. We will come back on Polish and Lithuanian Ruthenian history. At some point, also more directly have something incoming on that. And we will especially take into consideration the various polities per se, and how they fare, especially in the 16th and the 17th century. We start with the later Middle Ages. First of all, as you know, I made lots of videos on this topic, from the one on the Lipka Tatars that stretched basically the entirety of modern contemporary warfare timeline. We talked about, of course, the late medieval Polish and Lithuanian powers. We haven't talked so much about the Mongols, the Tatars in Eastern Europe, outside, in fact, of the emigres, the refugees that were installed, especially in Poland, in Lithuania. However, that's part of the story. We covered a lot of Ruthenian history, including Ukrainian history, of the Ruthenian Palatinate history, throughout all basically the area up to the 19th and 20th century, and we've looked at the Ukrainian struggle. We also looked at the Cossacks at some point, especially from a military point of view, within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth army. In fact, we will expand a bit more on that frontier. We will look at the Zaporizhian Cossacks. We will look at the Hetmanate as well. So that's mostly the story we want to make. We made videos on Moldova as well. We made a video about the Italians and the Ottomans in the struggles in the Black Sea. So again, we have a pretty complete picture of the area for a substantial part of the Middle Ages and modern, even the contemporary era. We go a bit more in depth. If it wasn't for the fact that today, at least, we have to introduce the prodromes in function of this story, right? During the mid-14th century, the Mongol held over the steppe regions north of the Black Sea. The steppes, remember, the forested areas belonged to the Slavs historically. That was mainly the boundary. That's where Kiev had been born, initially as a Khazar stronghold or, again, a previous settlement as well, but eventually taken over by the Slavs, that eventually from there, under also the guidance, the direction of the Varangians, began to destroy basically the entire Khaganate and seizing control of the river mouth fortresses of most of the region. We made really lots of videos about the Kievan Rus as well. The picture is fascinating. If anything, in our video about Ruthenian warfare between the 11th and 14th century, we have sort of well characterized this area as a bit in between Europe and Asia, not quite literally from a geographical point of view, but in a broader cultural and political in military sense, right? We observed the Kumans, we've seen all the Karakalpaks, all the various, eventually Turkic auxiliaries, that whose ethnogenesis in some ways had actually basically betrayed an Indo-European background. If you look at the Tatars, these were technically a European people, not much sort of a Turkic one. We've seen the Volga Bulgars, we have looked at the Caspian Sea as well, and this power, this Mongol power of the Golden Horde in this period is gradually weakening, right? This would, in a broader historical perspective, leave a power vacuum that the Muscovy, think about the Battle of Kulikovo, but especially in this time period, Lithuania and Poland, who were a greater power, of course, were keen to exploit. Naturally, the picture is not devoid of complications, as we will understand now. In the later period, especially the Ottomans will come to play a very important role there. I talked a bit about, for example, Podolia. We talked about the broader Ukrainian history and function of the Polish-Ottoman frontier, for example. We've seen the forgotten campaign of 1683-84 after the Ottoman defeat at Vienna, but we're a bit far from today's timeline. So what was really happening? The decline of the Mongol Kipchak Horde, that is to say the Golden Horde. This occurred specifically after the mid-14th century, stemming from multiple causes. In a broader sense, you can argue that, as I explained in many videos about the Mongols at large, and again, I've never made a video about the Golden Horde, we should expand also non-Christian polities in the historical regional series. I really must do something about the Huns, the Avars, the Magyars too, but also the Golden Horde and others, right, the Pechenegs, etc. So again, we understand naturally the steppe corridors, longitudinal extent mostly that these events take place along, right? And you will look at these powers realizing that one founded on the steppes is not really particularly long-lasting. This is basically the entire history of the steppes. This is basically the history of the Mongol Empire per se. We'll well know that civilization lays in the Sedentary world, and even Eastern Europeans were more performing compared to these nomads. And I always stress this because there's seemingly maybe not this enormous emphasis on how big and cocky the steppe nomads really were as a whole, but especially as far as the Mongol conquest is concerned, it obviously was a big thing, and it was a hell of an oceanic empire and so on. But if you look at its rise and fall, you really can appreciate some dynamics that makes you realize that there is no comparison with civilization, and not even just the Western one that indeed sort of dominated, hegemonized the entire Western Eurasia, the Mediterranean beyond, right? We really observed this in many videos, especially like even if you go outside of properly direct European control, but properly trade and banking dominance. It's a big thing, and I've honestly never, of course, like we study these things in universities, but in a normal school or university curriculum, you're not essentially getting how big by magnitudinal scale the phenomenon was, as if there were all these other, mystical Oriental powers were so big and cohesive. Not quite really. On top of this, we're really looking at the late medieval crisis centuries. And so you have things like the Black Death's devastating impact on population and trade that hits a bit everyone, including the Mongols. And again, the Turco-Mongols, however you want to call the Kipchaks, the Golden Horde. And that's also, in fact, an interesting story because aside from the aforementioned sort of multi-ethnical background of these people, so with a Mongolized elite fundamentally and still basically Turks and or Europeans in living in this place, including sedentaries to some degree because the steppes was not just nomads, without mentioning the older hordes. I don't know, there was the White Horde, for example, still within this one. I made an interview with, I don't tell you whom last year that hasn't published. The interviewer was asking me specifically about Lithuania and its interaction with the Golden Horde. And if anything, if you understand how messy the Golden Horde internal policy really was, you have a gist of how also unstable the system fundamentally was as well. And the Black Death definitely does not have a good impact on the world. Not only the Pax Mongolica Empire were fractured by this, but the same stability of these nomadic peoples that basically stopped also their periodical incursions at that point up to Poland, where, for example, like up to, in fact, the 14th century, the Golden Horde invaded. There had been three major expeditions since the first arrival of the Mongols in Central Europe. This were telling you also how very close, from a military but also cultural point of view, the Central Europe is from the steppes, right? If you think about Poland, you say, oh, well, but, the connection with the Mongols is just they're Eastern European. Poland is Central Europe. Central Europe is Germany, is Hungary, right? Is Bohemia. We've seen this, in fact, also in the videos about, Bohemian warfare. We've seen it in the relatively lighter bias of cavalry, even of that roughly importantly westernized and Germanized militarily and socially wise country. We've seen it with the Kumans being used in large amounts by the Hungarians, to be seen more or less frequently in Germany even. And there's all a story there that we covered, especially in the videos about medieval Hungary, as far as being the westernmost part contained, the westernmost part of the steppes, a receptacle for most refugees leaving the Pontic steppe during, in particular, the Mongol invasions. And the Kumans were used as a sort of, Praetorian element against of the kings of Hungary against the ethnic oligarchy that was gradually undermining and collapsing essentially the kingdom as an elective monarch, like it happens basically the entirety of Central Europe. But there are many things that are happening, including, for example, the important expansion of Poland that for some reason escaped the most nefarious consequences of the Black Death. And that began to expand, thus in very sort of labor force, mostly that would be translated in that, but also manpower, in the expansion towards Ruthenia. For those who follow me, essentially what had been happening there. Will now, however, address it more instrumentally for today's video, and those who weren't there, who were discussing these things, that I have plenty of very specific playlists dedicated to all of these topics. And we are further replenishing them with infinite stuff, basically. The Golden Horde had, as a consequence, gone under dynastic crisis within the Ukid house, which shifted authority to, in fact, a non-Ukid emir, Mamai. These were essentially Mongol houses that had converted to Islam, as it had happened also in the Ilkhanate. Except these were Sunnis, right? And the Persians naturally were Shias. And the event had triggered a rebellion led by the famous Toktamish with the support from Timur the Lame, that, as you know, was a major warlord, essentially the last great, you can argue, Mongol leader. There was a very important sort of legacy stemming probably from the Kingizids that all these leaders cared incredibly about, according to, as we've seen, the traditional doctrine of the sanctity of blood. Timur the Lame may have as well been an Indo-European, an Afghan, all right? And surely there was a lot there mixed with Persia. With the Turks, there was a very heavily Turkic background to that. The Mongols had not really sort of been able to ethnically hegemonize the steppes like the Turks had historically done since late antiquity. If anything, from mostly an ethno-cultural point of view rather than a strictly genetic one. This is important, as we're talking about before, about also the Tatars that are in great part, I mean, some of them are very, Turco-Mongolian, sort of Far Eastern looking, others are very sort of white, Slavic, Iranian looking. And in any case, these clashes within the Golden Horde, as you can expect, were not, contextual to a very highly sensitive, feeling towards human mercy or similar amenities. And so, aside from, impale, scorched alive, and burned alive people, you have this very interesting, by the way, interferences from the various chunks, especially the westernmost, but also Central Asian ones of the former Mongol Empire, that bring, in fact, in these frontiers that can't even be properly drawn, if not by rivers and or climatic zones at some point. Where does the Golden Horde end in these? Right, there are wide areas that they nominally control, but that they have practically nothing to do with. That end up, famously enough, witnessing the same Toktamish, that, as we've seen, had actually risen against Mamai, that had basically dethroned the Euclid house, as, of course, Toktamish had become sort of a bit too powerful, especially for the northwestern flank of the Timurid boundaries. These wars were fought across the vast expanses around the lower Volga, the Caspian area, in the Caucasus, which is also pretty vast and, as you know, quite orographically difficult and tough territory. These were all just by different environmental standards, climatically, just in terms of terrain. The same Transoxiana. Think about the Sir Dry. You have, again, all these historical boundaries that had divided steppes peoples for a long time, that were being broken, in this case, by the fierce army of Timur the Lame. I think I made only one video about the Timurid army organization. It was a pretty old one, but we'll hopefully come back on that because it's one of the most fascinating armies of this centuries, essentially, end of the 14th, beginning of the 15th. You finally witness to the failure of Khan Edigay's final effort to consolidate the Golden Horde in 1411. The Timurids had, by the way, given a pretty heavy initial blow to the Kipchaks. And this brought to some internal power redistribution. In fact, you have an internal fragmentation exacerbated by the loss of key nomadic allies, such as the Nogai Tatars, that were a significant tribal confederacy within the Khanate of the Golden Horde, and that began to assert autonomy by the 90s, exactly moment of the crisis with the heaviest blows received by the Golden Horde, further reducing the latter's military and sort of overall cohesion in the steppes region. As you know, the most important change of this is the establishment by the 20s of the 15th century of Crimea, of what would become the Khanate of this peninsula, separated from the rest of the Kipchak horde. Right, so the Nogais had been historically, and you can argue, yes, that there is a joke is Crimea Russian or Ukrainian, like those kind of things. Well, historically, had it been for the Stalinist deportations, Crimea was Tatar, right? It still is, and within Ukraine rather than Russia. In any case, this group had really began to exploit not just the fragmentation of the broader horde, but also their proximity to civilization. In fact, in a province which was at the center historically of many intercontinental trade nets, namely like the famous, I don't know if you look at Tanais, Azov, all the various Crimean ports as well. This had historically been controlled first by the Greeks, then the Romans, then the Byzantines, then the Italians. Finally, this still hasn't happened, but the Ottomans. And there are lots of different communities, also the so-called gods of Crimea. The Genoese were there, also historically up the 18th century or later was a flourishing community within whichever power had fundamentally maintained the stability in the region. Crimea had thus enucleated itself, by the way, not as the only part of the Golden Horde to essentially secede. In fact, Kazan in the northeast, in a continental context on the upper Volga, had also seceded, or at least they would in the 40s of 15th century, to be precise about the chronology. So that the Kipchak Khans, by the way, did resist, however, being left only with the lower Volga region and their former capital Sarai. Right, you know that historically this territory had belonged to the aforementioned Bulgars, right, that arrived there during the migration era, I made, again, a video about let's say, Volga-Bulgar warfare. And you know what kind of sort of blend of Turks, Iranians, Slavs this had been? Because, again, also, where's the frontier here, right? We often highlight on Schwerpunkt how, for example, Germany does not have an eastern frontier. It's open to the Ostsiedlung and then Drang nach Osten to be sort of more aggressively minded. But the question is also, as far as, for example, Eastern Europeans, the Slavic expansion, how far east does that go? And I'm not talking about the Tsarist expansion that will sort of gain momentum, in fact, especially in the 16th century, towards and across Siberia. We're talking probably the original sort of ancient and medieval European colonization of these territories. It went pretty far. The same goes for the population. We've seen this for example, in the videos about medieval Finland. What about the Finnic hinterland? Where's the boundary there? You realize that the Finns today, yes, they speak the local, in fact, Finnic language, but they're essentially Swedish colonies, ethnogenetically, at least not entirely. They're pretty dark people. So however, a country that is, I think, the exact whitest in the world, together with, in fact, Sweden, especially in the central parts of these countries, latitudinally speaking. And just observing how close, in fact, these lands are to an otherwise sort of very savage, underdeveloped, primitive, but in this sense, somehow underdocumented frontier where many of these groups were also pushed further. So you can imagine what kind of blends of populations, and even more in the steppes, had historically occurred. As the Kipchak Khan's control over the Tatar tribes in fact, their formerly controlled steppe waned, reducing themselves, as we've seen, just mostly to Sarai. It was a massive sort of fortified trade post on the Volga, and so historically had flourished under the Bulgars, even after the Mongol conquest, like also proven at this point, because there was a cyclical reemergence of this Bulgar substratum also within the Mongol, namely at least Mongol dominations. The Kipchak territory became increasingly referred to as the Great Horde. And so something more reminiscent of bygone times, echoing the ancient fasts of this Mongol, Turkic populations. The succession wars, in particular the one with Timur the Lame, were largely fought, as we've seen, in the eastern parts of the Kipchak Horde. So the least developed, and the, in fact, more frontier ones that had tested the same, otherwise very step adequate and advanced, in that case, like either to Kipchak or Timurid logistics. However, these struggles also eroded the Khan's dominance over the western territories, as we've just seen. Western territories, including Crimea, were tendentially more developed and historically more sedentarized. Right? Think about the Khazars that historically had pretty much resented of the sort of the influence of civilization in different ways from the Middle East, from Europe, and had gradually sort of feudalized, building also impressive fortresses and sedentarizing to the important extent that paradoxically would make them more vulnerable to the Slavo-Norse raids at the time of the booming of the Kievan expansion. In part, this had happened because of the necessity of controlling the trading hubs along the northern Black Sea coast and the steppe hinterland stretching from the Danube to the Don River. Naturally, this region had historically been hegemonized by Europeans, in particular, from a continental point of view, the Slavs, that again with a broader Rus had, and especially from Kiev, exercised the greater control in these areas. The main problem historically was that since there is the steppes, right? Look at the map of the Russian invasion of Ukraine today. Basically, what the Russians control is exactly what historically was the steppe, right? So garbage in practice, aside from the changes of the very partial changes of industrialization, there was no point for any civilized world to control those places. Of course, there were some Slavs that were pushing, like creating settlements, farming, etc. So in areas that were historically as routinely subjected to these waves of nomads, especially from the east historically, and gradually sort of resisting and bringing civilization. But from, of course, a medieval power handling perspective, it was much easier to, as we said before, just controlling the strongholds at the mouths of the major riverways. And so basically you had the forested, more fertile, actually hinterland of the Slavic world, deeply connected also with Byzantines, but even way more than it's normally and correctly stressed, the West, right? The Kivans imported Western weapons at the peak of their power, and they drew much more from that than from the Byzantines, that didn't even match the Turks in that degree, and the Ruthenians had, in fact, the upper hand on those populations in the steppes. So if you control just those territories, basically the steppes became just some sort of sandwiched area of weaker peoples that, while mingling in the Ruthenian dynastic struggles that at some point begin to plague and to weaken the power, in fact, never had any upper hand or control. Not even, in fact, during the Mongol invasions, yet because the Mongols could exact tributes, but it's not like they were simply lording and controlling the Slavs as a whole. Like in some ways they were, especially if you look at the Muscovy, for example, was the most adept, sort of the most obedient servant of the Golden Horde. Historically, that's also the reason why, as literally the most underdeveloped place, in the Rus at that point, sort of gained more prominence. But in general, the capacity even just of the Mongol forces to do more than raiding in the sedentary areas, and especially they were forested, that were not good for cavalry. Not even the Kievan princes historical, the Rusian princes as a whole had much of a grip on the agricultural hinterland, right? Because if it was full of woods, of sort of reluctant militias, mostly the infantries of the Ruthenian armies were drawn from probably the third estate of the great strongholds, dominating from their Kremlins the major riverways of Eastern Europe. And that's how Kiev, for example, had become such a huge thing historically. As you know, also Novgorod would maintain, in that case, particularly republicanly commercial bias, right? At least compared, to Eastern European standards. And so, to make the long story short, there had always been, in a way or another, a sedentary control over these areas, as it would also come to be the case for the Ottomans, that at the end of the day also expanded, but were born even as a polity from the Marmara Sea, and so literally into basically Europe, or just on the other side of the Anatolian, but heavily Europeized territory. There was also a lot of back and forth with the Italian maritime republics that, as we've seen in many videos, had historically hegemonized the Mediterranean, especially in the east. At this point, there was Aragon, the Catalans in the west, but historically, Genoa and Venice had maintained overall the upper hand in the broader Mediterranean lake, so to say, which at least provided with the opportunity of controlling these river ports and seaports at the same time. In this case, because we're looking again at Eastern Europe and the waterways that flow from there, but that were also, in the Levant, etc. Some of the, at least the most important trade hubs at the end of the westernmost branches of the Silk Road. Right, some of these actually entered Europe. Transylvania had something like that, and in fact, there was a great attention of the Italians also, not just in Crimea and the Azov Sea, but also on the western coast of the Black Sea, actually also in Anatolia. And we'll talk, if anything, more about this. These Turco-Mongol powers had historically tried to dislodge the Italians from all these various citadels that they had, by the way, enormously developed. Look at, the fortress of Sudak in Crimea, what the Genoese were able of building there. So routinely, of course, the Italians had a very sort of elite but contained, in this case for their Republican and economically minded bias compared to steppes powers, and they could send very well trained, armored, disciplined forces to resist. In fact, in these fortresses that on top of that were supplied from the sea, right? The Turco-Mongols didn't have essentially navies, especially anything that could compete with the Italians at this point. Later, the Ottomans, of course, would do so because they will seize the Byzantine, harbors and ship building and dockyards, facilities, etc. But in general, like the steppes peoples, the Mongol-derived powers were pretty scarce in that. And if you don't have a fleet to basically chase away, like, for example, the Mamluks partially did at the Siege of Acre, for example, 1291. I made a video about that. There is no way to dislodge the garrison that is kept being supplied. Of course, you can try assaults, you can try to wear out the enemy that has to pour men into it, but as we've seen also in our videos about medieval siege warfare, the defenders naturally had, if anything, you had to commit very large forces to dislodge the Italians from even relatively small settlements, because again, it's not like, even Tanais was such a big endemic center. We're talking again some incredibly primitive and backward places historically speaking. They had just a great commercial strategic importance. In any case, Timur the Lame managed to capture the key Venetian-controlled port of Tana, so Azov, while the Genoese, in return for aiding against Mamai, and of course the Venetians and the Genoese were also against one another in this case, so rooting with these various factions in the hinterland to dislodge each other, gained Toktamish's acknowledgement of their authority over Kaffa, a famous port in Crimea, as well others, in fact, in the province, and along, of course, the entirety of the northwestern Black Sea coast. All right, the Genoese were more powerful than the Venetians in the Black Sea. That's also why they get the better deal. As you know, they are very well installed in the Galata quarter in Constantinople, just from the other side of the Golden Horn, compared to the Byzantine capital center, palace, and everything. They had other territories in Anatolia, in the north, but not only, in the Aegean. The Genoese also fortified Kaffa's defenses further after this, constructing a double-walled citadel by 1380, which allowed them to maintain control over the port despite recurrent wars with local Tartar groups. We haven't talked so much, if anything, about military engineering at this time in history. And of course, in many ways, it was relatively homogeneous by Western standards, but Italy was particularly advanced. And again, we will look at this better, if anything, in another video explaining it. And again, I made that video about Italians, Ottomans, and Tatars for the Eurasian Steppes series. That is interesting because I always add this kind of more sedentary Western element that routinely interacted in those areas we've seen in different episodes, right, from, if anything, a more Western perspective, but that's exactly the video that you need in order to look at this scenario from especially a maritime point of view, the coastal point of view. Naturally, also for these polities, you have everything pretty well laid out in the respective playlists. We talked about Genoese and Venetian warfare quite recently during the course of the 14th century. We will continue along that path. In any case, Timur's actions, as we've seen, severed the Kipchak horde's trade connections to Persia and Transoxiana. As a consequence, the Great Horde had diminished influence over the Black Sea commerce with Constantinople and Trebizond, weakening the same Italian trade. In fact, the Genoese redirected much of the Black Sea one to their ports at Licostomo and Mauro Castro, enhancing commerce along the Danube into Hungary and across the Dniester into Poland to make up for that. This is quite fascinating for a number of reasons, not just what we were saying before regarding the Western trade dominance and banking power was largely in the hands of the Italians still, and was able to sort of hegemonize even those countries that were trying, as like under Timur, to be sort of functional, at least to control these fluxes mostly for an internal purpose. Timur died trying to invade China, so of course in a time where that aforementioned Pax Mongolica had died, it's not like the Italians had remained at the times of Marco Polo, right, that toured up to the Far East across all these territories. And given what we said about Poland before, relatively spared by the Black Death, there were new markets in Central and Eastern Europe that were sort of also gradually civilizing further, that the Italians could control by controlling, in fact, most of the trade ports in the western part of the Black Sea, and rising up also, at least controlling the same riverways and fluvial ports with their mercantile presence and more. This naturally involved the Genoese. We've seen it especially in the video about medieval Moldova, and all the various sort of political strifes, the spheres of influence, and so on. This is typical, especially of the 15th century, and in particular the Genoese redirection of market strategies was facilitated by the establishment of regular trade caravans from Kaffa to Lviv by 1400. So in particularly tying with Galicia. We made multiple videos about that. We'll come back on that. These were all territories that had, with the decline of the Kievan Rus and the gradual sort of emancipation of these various Ruthenian Palatinate lands in the west, however, bringing these under the increasing protection of the West. There is the Uniate Church, the papacy has brokered deals with the local, in fact, Greek Catholic, not Greek Orthodox churches. These are the most advanced parts of the entire Rus. They are properly going on their own. They don't even really care much about Constantinople at all. And they are the most prestigious and spiritually influent land in the entire Rus, regardless of what later the Moscow will come to claim with pretty shady deals, including, incarcerating the Patriarch of Constantinople, just like the Ottomans were doing at the same time. This also means, however, a great sort of an increasing gravitation around Poland. As you know, most of these territories, probably the vastity of Ukraine had been taken over by the Lithuanians, but these were to historically fall gradually in their own dynastic some, at least, with Poland gradually under the influence of the latter, because it was also quite consistently, and regardless of size, in fact, the greater power. All right. In fact, I think the part of the interview was not published because I was actually reducing, in a sensible way, the actual impact of Lithuania in a broader sense. Aside from the fact that Lithuanians had been literally civilized by the Ruthenians, they adopted literally their own script. Like, there wasn't a Lithuanian script. They adopted the Ruthenian of the Ruthenian Palatinate. There were much more developed areas than Lithuania. But, of course, Poland, as a whole, actually was the one who saved Lithuania. It was an old enemy. I mean, the Poles had called the Teutonic Knights to dislodge essentially the same Baltic pagans to which Lithuania sort of the group like to which Lithuania belonged. It doesn't matter we're talking about the old Prussians or the Lithuanians. The latter had been enemies of this broader crusading enterprise until the Teutonic Knights had begun to pressure the same Poland. So you have an alliance, as you know, that mostly favors the say, mostly saves the Lithuanians in as much as they are the weakest side of the story. They had managed to take over the entirety of Ruthenia, but still not making it to stop the Teutonic Knights. Without Poland, they would have been taken over. So it's a complicated picture, but also a pretty straightforward one. Beyond these fundamentals, there isn't much to sort of debate regarding the political and strategical balance. You have, as we were saying here, a big deal of Genoese redirection again of, for example, silk, spices, and furs trade caravans. The important here, the Italians were just controlling the ports. They had, as we've seen, the manpower, the means properly to do so, and of course, by controlling these choke points, they could simply have trade flow automatically from these places. I mean, silk would arrive from far away, spices as well, furs from the more savage hinterland. Of course, the Italians were bringing something on the market by themselves from the west, but largely they were exploiting these very trade posts. So what happens in the process is that this economic ties between the Black Sea and the Polish markets increased under the Genoese. This naturally drove Poland further towards the southeast, right? Which, again, is something that you can follow in my videos about Poland and Ruthenia regarding the most obvious dynamic of Poland trying to hegemonize the more politically vulnerable areas of the Rus that would otherwise, be unreachable, as they were being harassed, by the way, by the Mongols. Until also the Lithuanians there had defeated also the Mongols. That tells you, in fact, how we'll talk more about the Battle of Blue Waters, that some people think to be a myth, but it's not at all. If anything, because exactly after that date, surprise, surprise, the Lithuanians take over the entirety of Ukraine. So, it must have been something. So this shift further undermined the Great Horde's standing, especially in the Danubian region, because these steppe peoples had historically tried to pass through the Carpathians and the Black Sea and breaking through the lower Danube and harassing, for example, the Byzantine Empire, arriving up to literally, Serbia, breaking balls. And the general collapse of the Golden Horde, in the general strengthening of the Genoese control, and of the Polish one, respectively, from the Black Sea and Central Europe, changes really very much like the political geography of this land that are a corner between Central, Eastern, and Europe and the Balkans, basically, facilitating the rise of new states. We've seen it well in the videos about Wallachia, for example, that essentially freed itself from, had historically been at least a nominal Hungarian control south of the Carpathians. The Wallachians had sort of emerged from the mist, let's say, of the early Middle Ages, as basically this still Romance-speaking mountaineer populations that gradually accomplished the late medieval crisis began to descend from the highlands to and their pastoral life and to settle in some of the fertile lowlands, constituting probably some relevant principalities south of the and east of the Carpathians. In fact, Moldavia emerged as an independent principality as well, which was also attentively mostly Hungarian, like by claim, because Hungary had its own sort of imperial ambitions and historical sort of also steppe kind of bias in political vision to some extent. But as you know, especially Moldavia, because eventually Wallachia is taken over by the Ottomans, one way or another. And Moldavia will remain more contended as a more frontier and relatively isolated area that controlled, however, again, important river valleys, especially ports in the Black Sea that were partly shielded by the Carpathians. And again, there wasn't like an immediate and straightforward power in the immediate east. So this brought Hungary, Poland, and the Ottoman Turks to vie for the allegiance of this black powers that resisted. Thanks to this, they knew how to play the game a bit, even though they gradually lost control over their dependence. That's also what happened to Transylvania. We've seen it in the video, for example, about, again, Podolia, because lots of things change across the Carpathians in that instance after Vienna. We've seen it also notoriously in the first phase of the 30 Years' War, with the Transylvanians even being able to almost capture Vienna in the picture. So those are fascinating lands we will describe more in depth at some point, also for early modern history and warfare. In all this, accomplice different dynamics prompted some prospects or sort of enthusiasm for territorial expansion towards this lower Danubian area, mostly in countries like Poland, Hungary, but even Bohemia and Austria. If anything, not necessarily for a direct control of the same, that could be achieved only by some of these powers, but for forming crusade alliances, initially targeting the Tatars in the east. That's how, for example, the Moldavians had been partially delegated by the Hungarians to, because they actually came from Transylvania at some point, and they crossed the Carpathians to settle in the east. And by the centuries close, because, and the Tatars as also a relatively vague terminology. Most historically, they were the Cumans who were creating problems. Even the Teutonic Knights had been, as you know, settled in Transylvania for the same purpose of shielding also across the mountains from nomadic invasions before the Hungarians got rid of them and sent them to Poland rather. And by the centuries closely, really, the Ottoman Turks that were obviously the greater problem for all these countries that immediately realized that, especially with the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and the, in fact, the inconsistency of these black powers, they would have soon become the first line of frontier warfare and possible and actual targets of expansion for the Ottomans. I'm preparing more videos, by the way, about the Turkish wars, and especially in the early period that we haven't quite covered much, especially as far as we talked about that for the Mediterranean part, but this area as a whole is quite interesting to browse in its complexity, because the Ottomans will play a lot into those political ambiguities, and as much as the Balkans had fundamentally opened the gates to them to prevent like other powers to take over, especially from the Catholic side of the aisle, these, as you know, many Christians actually served, and not like through the Devshirvan as janissaries, but as actual Christian contingents in the Ottoman armies, even in the sieges of Vienna during the 16th and the 17th century. The weakening of the Great Horde primarily spurred the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Kingdom of Poland, and the Grand Principality of Moscow to extend their territories southward toward the Black Sea. That, as you have understood, is not a deserted area, because there isn't just the steppes that are still populated anyway, but there is a great part of Ruthenia. And let's get a bit more into that. In 1362, Lithuanian Grand Duke Algirdas triumphed over the Kipchak Khan near the Bug's Mouth, annexing Chernihiv, Novgorod, Seversky, Kiev, Pereyaslav, and Podolia. This was a major victory that Algirdas achieved at the Battle of the Blue Waters in the same year, together with a combined force of Lithuanian and Ruthenian troops. Leveraging superior cavalry tactics to outmaneuver the Horde's forces, securing control over the key fortresses like Kiev. We know very few about this battle. In actual fact, this speaks volumes, of course, of the radical divide in development between Western and Eastern Europe, who practically just have Renaissance sources talking about this clash. And so much so that people that have no context, not much of a political, strategical vision, and education think, so this had to be made up. So basically everything that is not like, we have a movie of, in the past may have not existed. I mean, those people that say, no, the Battle of Zama was made up, or those, it's difficult, of course, to explain how wrong such concept is to a person, especially whose mindset is set on that kind of, at the end of the day, conspiratorial and non-scientific thinking. Regardless of the sort of historiographical sort of tradition on the Battle of Blue Waters, that of course renders very poor accounts of the war, the fact that, well, on the same year, an overwhelmingly vast territory, such as basically the one of the entire Ukraine, fell into the hands of the Lithuanians. So starting the also historical centuries-old domination of the same, nominally by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, naturally through a very also decentralized rule and lots of Ruthenians maintaining power, as we will see now. It's kind of, it passes, especially at that historical speed, because of course we have lots of other informations confirming that this sweeping victory had been achieved across the whole region is undeniable. It's in front of everybody's eyes, right? This speaks volumes also of on the Ruthenian support for the general enterprise, the fact that the Golden Horde had become an obsolete power. And again, if you look at the political events of the various powers involved in synchrony, you realize, of course, that, again, that the Golden Horde was plagued by the obviously uncivilized, right, the typical uncivilized characteristics of steppe dominions, right? So there was nothing also overwhelmingly terrible or overpowering about steppe powers, the Golden Horde, etc. They had been powerful. Let's be honest about this. Let's not deny it. Again, they had the upper hand in the region for a long time, but the, again, capacity to simply hegemonize the system and to build and to expand further and to directly control and was not there, right? They all they did was basically major raids, also fueled by all the scum of the earth gathering from God knows where in the bowels of Central Asia, just to say, okay, we're making an expedition there. The more join, the more chances there is to get anything. And of course, if you're a person who basically has just a bunch of horses as entire possessions and nothing else, everything will do, right? These were brutal cultures, by the way. They practiced slavery on a quite sort of unique scale. Of course, in Northeastern Europe, slavery was a thing, would be a thing for a very long time, up to a few hundred years ago. Of course, mostly in the rest of Europe, that had been surpassed, if anything. There were slaves, as you've seen also the Italians engaged in that, but mostly because they were trading these lesser people from other continents. It had nothing to do with the general vibes of Western Europe and also the horrors of the Turkish wars in the Mediterranean that, while reviving that, in fact, were particularly peculiar to that kind of holy warfare and this proximity to other peoples normally practice slavery in the places like Africa and Asia and so on. So this step is the Battle of Blue Waters is really big, right? The acquisition of Podolia stretched Lithuanian territory to the Black Sea coast, making the Grand Duchy essentially the largest contiguous territorial state in the second half of the 14th century, Europe. As we've seen, this actually means a very few. These are the things, this country was so big. Yeah, okay, but it was not a particularly developed one by European standards by far. And actually, the most advanced places actually were in Ukraine, not even in Lithuania, in many other Russian cities further sort of north and east. So let's be concrete also about the actual nature of this territorial contiguity. Again, we're not looking at 19th century nation states, levels of population, of strategic control, of interconnection, communications, whatever. It's an incredibly complicated thing. And again, the Lithuanians do not go very far in terms of sort of national autonomy within what will eventually be essentially the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Polish monarchs were, in the meanwhile, pursuing the annexation, as we've seen, of the actually most developed parts of Ruthenia that had partially escaped, in fact, from the Lithuanian acquisition. Why? Because the Poles were already sort of signaling that they were interested in them. We're talking about Galicia. We've seen it before. So these were the most advanced Russian lands. The Chelmno-Belge region, expanding Polish control over trade routes linking the Black Sea to Central Europe, but also just on pretty large amounts of people overall, because, again, there was not an overwhelming population density in Eastern Europe. We're talking, as we've seen, large swathes of this territory. So at large, by 14th century, societal and sort of productive standards, it was still, of course, something you didn't want to miss as subjects and labor force to lord over and get the surplus of. By 1370, King Casimir III of Poland had formalized Polish rule over Galicia through a treaty with Hungarian allies that were allies just by name. Of course, the Poles and the Hungarians hated each other, and they were always trying to strip each other, in fact, from the control of these lands, over which, again, there were, in particular from Hungary, pretty sort of straightforwardly open claims of historical as institutional overlordship that, in part, those same Galician rulers had played upon. Right, there had been Hungarian lords that had been called by the Galicians to make order and then to engage into the chronic factionalism of those lands. Again, made lots of videos about Galicia if you're interested. I haven't created actually a playlist about Galicia, but if you search for Ruthenian history, Ukrainian history, you will find plenty of this. So this mechanism essentially incorporated this area's trade networks into Poland's growing economic sphere. Consider that, indeed, between Galicia and Hungary, there are the Carpathians, and so Poland, that is also, as you know, even throughout medieval times, changing very much boundaries and shape in that regard, was squeezing like a rhomboid figure towards the southeast, which exactly overlapped with those territories that historically, in fact, will fall at some point, probably within the Kingdom of Poland, even though they were largely ethnically Ukrainian. And they would be specifically the ones that, after the partitions of Poland, will fall into the Habsburgic Empire, right? And some of these lands witnessed Russian control for less than 1 century historically. And so that's also interesting. These were the areas that cultivated the most, probably a sense of Ukrainian identity. The Greek Catholic Church, that was a thing since the Middle Ages, and leading into also the educational reforms of Maria Theresa and Joseph II, informing a pretty strong sense of Ukrainian nationalism, especially in the age of Romanticism, nationalism in the 19th century. Again, made lots of videos about this, and mostly growing this hatred as would break out also with the massacres in Galicia and Volhynia in the first part of the 20th century, because essentially the Middle Ages had remained in these lands with essentially a Polish and Jewish urban world of some sort, where in fact the Poles had installed their nobility and used the Jews mostly, as it was the case in Central Europe, for this more administrative tax collection, financial roles, and the overwhelming majority of the entire country was overwhelmingly agricultural and extensive and enormous, was, of course, basically uniquely Ukrainian. So that was the most obvious landscape. But going back to our Middle Ages, Algirda's successor, Jogaila, so Yagel basically, resumed tribute payments to the Khan. Why? Because, of course, it was a condition of power sharing. Not even after the Battle of the Blue Waters, of course, the Mongol raids could simply be stopped. So at this point, paying tribute doesn't mean to be a subject. It means mostly to avert further disruptions in these territories. Also because now these territories have entrusted themselves to you. And so not just had the Mongols invaded, they called them the Mongols by approximation, of course. There would have had to be a military response. But at that point, the Ruthenian subjects would have been pretty much triggered by this, and they would have resented towards you. It could have led to further disgregation. So, given that the Poles were not also simply, suspense in a vacuum, and the southeastern frontier was not, in spite of the opportunities that were arising, the top priority in the whole sort of political and strategical balance of the Polish kingdom. Plus there was a substantial Lithuanian connection. In fact, Jogaila here is we're looking at Lithuanian rulers, and this is before, in fact, even the conversion. There was the same goes for Poland, by the way, and again, they were doing exactly the same thing. And way before, like since the 13th century, that had been the case. Way before the Lithuanians, the Poles infiltrated these areas, they had historically not just clashed with the Mongols in Ruthenia, but they had extracted tributes themselves as the Mongols from the Ruthenians to gain, in fact, trying to gain the upper hand and wrestling in that. And the major shift had occurred indeed with the Battle of the Blue Waters, right? So, going back to our topic, the Lithuanians had, of course, seized lots of land by crushing the Mongols of the Blue Waters that they essentially took over. They installed themselves also as governors in many Ruthenian centers. The local nobility was habituated, as we've seen, to call different sort of foreigners to maintain control in their main centers. So this initially sort of favored, especially with the Lithuanians, a big deal of commixtion. The Lithuanians adopted the Ruthenian script because they didn't have one of their own. They really were civilized by the Ruthenian Palatinate, and still, like in the age of nationalism, Lithuania remembered this specific fact. Also because consider this, that Lithuania is an Eastern European country. Poland is not, and Poland is also more advanced, and so it has something more to bring. So there is a greater commixtion between Ruthenia and Lithuania, regardless of, again, the fact that the latter was more like the more predatory and lordly element, right? And so the former also the more military and socially subservient to a degree. Importantly enough, and to stress, however, this commixtion is many of these Lithuanian noblemen converted to the local Christianity. So from the Ruthenian side, so what had been historically like this broader Orthodox legacy, regardless of, again, of the Uniate Church that was mostly revolving around, as we've seen, the most Polish hegemonized westernmost parts. This was also in part a reaction to, in fact, the Polish power, because it's not like the Poles or the Lithuanians liked each other very much. And the Lithuanians had remained, many of them had still, including Jogaila, remained pre-Christian for different reasons that we explain, if anything, in the video about medieval Lithuania. And again, it's not like they were primitive tribesmen from the migration era. They had really played a lot with that, including negotiating for centuries with the Pope, mostly to escape the Teutonic Knights, and mostly remaining pre-Christian to trigger those and not giving up as a sort of social cohesion against the invaders. And so you see that when they land in this sort of more advanced and less threatening places, they convert spontaneously to Christianity. They supported the creation of a metropolitanate in Kiev. This is very important because it shows that, again, there was really no actual shift from the traditional centrality of Kiev as far as the spiritual center of the entire Rus was concerned. And so they embraced Ruthenian, Ukrainian legal, customs, local institutions, their language, obviously, at least in Ruthenia, which helped legitimize the rule over the local majority as well. And there is always a Ukrainian establishment that historically, as traditionally, like in other countries, was to accept, of course, the ruler on the basis of his respect towards the local customs, in a way. You can't quite, again, in the 14th century, especially from Lithuania, control this enormous territory. It is even more developed than yours with, coercive means, the totalitarian states of the 20th century. It does not exist, right? It's an incredibly shaded and decentralized system in that regard. Now, the reestablishment of the Kievan Metropolitanate in 1375 under Cyprian, backed by the Saint Jogaila, reinforced the local ecclesiastical authority, fostering loyalty among the Ruthenian population as well. This also contributed, as we explained, to the Ruthenianization of Lithuanian governance, but not only in Ruthenia, but in the same Grand Duchy's core regions, so the ethnic Lithuanian ones. In 1386, facing a revolt led by his cousin and backed by the Teutonic Order, typical dynamic in medieval Lithuania, this Lithuanians fighting constantly one another with the support also of the Teutonic Knights, this or that side. Jogaila, that was still negotiating a marriage with the princess of the Muscovy, right? So there could have been, in theory, like probably a Lithuanian Muscovite Commonwealth at some point, but that would have ended sort of badly in any case. Jogaila accepted a proposal from the Polish nobility instead. Of course, they chose civilization, and they converted accordingly to the Roman Rite. You understand how this would be consequential also in the Ruthenian, sort of in the central and eastern Ruthenian land controlled by Lithuanians, to sort of open a little bit more, regardless of the general Lithuanian backwardness, to a more Western dimension. In fact, Jogaila, famously enough, weds Jadwiga, the daughter of the late King Casimir III, and assumed the Polish throne as King Władysław II Jagiella, reigning between 1386 to 1434. This happens, by the way, in an incredibly complicated picture where there is also a great deal of settlement of the aforementioned Tatars, that, in particular in Lithuania, that will become incredibly faithful to Poland, to Lithuania. And there is an enormous story behind that I covered again in that video about the Lipka Tatar. Lipka means Lithuania in the local language. So to a level of also Islamic protection of this Catholic and Orthodox world against, for example, any Ottoman or Crimean, for example, advance, because many of these guys had come from Crimea as well, but they became now Lithuanians, and it's amazing how their mosques in Lithuania, there are a few remaining, but they're exactly the same sort of type of Lithuanian churches, except there is a crescent on top of that. And as you know, they will have a very important role as military colonists, as a part of the Polish-Lithuanian army in the later centuries, up to literally, the siege of Vienna, but even, the Nazi-Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. They were the same guys who successfully massacred large amounts of Wehrmacht infantry before the tanks showed up. And no, the Polish cavalry never charged tanks during World War II, but almost all their cavalry charges were successful, which is very interesting, in part because of this equestrian steppe legacy of units of Tatars as well, that eventually entered the maelstrom of sort of genocidal Nazi-Soviet dynamics in the following years. Now, the conversion of Lithuania was a big deal in European history. As we said, like there was a possibility technically of a connection with Muscovy. That would have been, however, less definitive, even had it really happened, and probably would have not really helped the Lithuanians that much, or at least like the Muscovites were more ferocious and sort of less interested in sort of kind of recognized partnership with them. It was better, of course, to join Poland. In this also not unification, as you understand, Jogaila was called to succeed the extinguished dynasty, ruling dynasty in Poland, and starting the Yagalonian one in that sense. And of course, Poland was a much better place to rule. Also, of course, for a Lithuanian leader. The conversion was formalized at the Council of Brest in 1386, where Jogaila's baptism as Vladislav solidified the dynastic union of the two countries and secured Polish support against the Teutonic threat as well. That was also a huge deal, because we will talk more about the Teutonic Knights now. Again, it was evident also to the Poles that had the Lithuanians being smashed by the Teutonic Knights, Poland would have basically been surrounded. All right, and Lithuania was about to be overrun by the Teutonic Knights. Again, there is this resist till the end myth, and the Lithuanians went on for centuries doing so, but in the end, they would have been overrun by the Teutonic Knights. They were just not capable of sort of civilizationally halting such. By the way, a cohesive state, like in fact the German monastic one really was, that had, again, the best sort of German societal, like technological support, but also the advantages of a non-feudal system, or at least, of course, there were different vassals to the order in these lands, but the core of the Ordensstaat, in fact, of state, was really run in a non-dynastic and non-partitionable way, right? And so it's mostly Poland that actually engineers this and manages to unite two countries that, again, had historically been enemies. The Lithuanians had been launching raids into Poland historically. They were pretty vicious and specializing in that kind of predatory fashion, developing cavalry on their own, and also because of their more Eastern European influence. But the Baltic peoples had historically otherwise not had a lot of cavalry. Just the Lithuanians succeed. And also because they take over Ruthenia, that was, just aside from the equestrian traditions, also pretty big and fueling some sort of more effective Lithuanian military, obviously passing through the time, and especially like in these countries, through cavalry. All right. And again, I made videos about this too for the Eurasian Steppe series, Lithuanians, Ruthenians, Poles in the 14th century in particular. You can pick especially that chapter up if you're interested in the military sort of divides, styles, etc. Lithuania maintained naturally an autonomy within this union. Again, this is a very traditional dynastic collection of powers. There is not a merging of the two powers. It will never actually happen. That's why also later in the 16th century you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because it's, I mean, there are different terms aside from the original that would be more just more interesting to etymologically explain, but exactly to stress the fact that naturally also the limits of that case of Polish power, like as we've seen all these Central European elective monarchies that couldn't really do whatever they wanted even within their own lands, at least to the degree that the Westerners could. And there was never like such a thing like an absolute monarchy at any time, right? That if anything begins with Napoleon and the state is the sole source of law, you know. And also today, frankly, you know, if you want to make a government crumble, you can't. Even in a centralized reality, also regardless of civil or common law, de facto, if you look at the power of the state today. The Lithuanian noblemen within this union were soon incorporated in the Polish noble estate, the Szlachta, though. This happened in different ways. For example, sharing equivalent privileges and responsibilities including electing Lithuania's Grand Duke and overseeing the Union's relations. So from one side, of course, by the definition of the Union, Lithuania was provided with a set of rules that first of all, favored governability within the same Lithuania, which historically had been a total mess of tribal warfare, like internecine, bloodbath, and on the other, you would be also recognized as a people within the Union with specific rights that were conferred by the same. On the other hand, not just, of course, the Lithuanians were being gradually civilized, especially by Poland now, as far as, again, simply a more developed political and social system was just presented to them. But the Poles began working by cooptation in fundamentally hegemonizing Lithuania as well. So there wouldn't be radical infringements on Lithuania's independence in a traditional world where different states can be sort of united by these means without canceling them, just like, in the totalitarian sense of the state and territoriality we mostly see in the 20th century. Just recently made a video about Holy War in the age of waning tradition that deals a bit also with that concept, that mentality. Think about what happened the poor, in fact, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a whole, so not just a Polish partition, but a Polish-Lithuanian partition already from the end of the 18th century, prefiguring, in fact, essentially the age of nation-state, where you have Poland reappearing as a state on a political map only after World War I. It's also weird how people take, for example, the existence of a formal political reality as the measure of the existence of a country, right? This is especially with mostly Russian propaganda. The war in Ukraine has suddenly, like, nobody cared about this stuff. Now suddenly, like, it pops up as if, Germany or Italy or whichever other country did not exist before. They actually existed in a unitary political sense, or as if Austria did not exist as a state per se, because historically had not been essentially a state compared to Germany at the same level. I mean, we get pretty weird stuff very often from the same people that live in countries. I mean, not Austria in this case, we're talking things like Slovakia or others that, in fact, at some point did not even technically exist as in those terms, and or were taken over by other policies and so on. But again, if you know the history, you just know through the politics and warfare in the society that, of course, these realities existed. Otherwise, all these issues would have neither existed to begin with. The 1387 Act of Krevo is notoriously the formalization of this first Polish-Lithuanian Union, right? This is the first one. Eventually, the Commonwealth is born in 200 years later, but de facto, at least the pair, the Union is born, stimulating mutual defense obligations, especially at that time as these powers were gearing up against the formidable Teutonic army, and the integration, in fact, of Lithuanian nobles into Poland's political framework, mostly for this sake. I mean, they had to provide historically to the sovereign that was also a Lithuanian one, even in the guise of the Polish one, their own military retinues. There are boyars that were not, as we've seen, like this will be seen at Battle of Tannenberg, so highly performing as the Polish ones, because again, this Eastern European cavalries were generally speaking more volatile and less compact than the Central European ones, just like also the Teutonic ones in particular. while, however, preserving Lithuania's distinct administrative structure, because obviously the Lithuanians were not simply to open the gates to anything Polish per se. They wanted mostly to secure their oligarchic positions, just like the Szlachta was doing, even towards Vladislav Jagiellon. And as you know, ultimately being the main case for the collapse of the Union after centuries, though. But it was basically the same mechanism in Hungary that fell earlier anyway. The Jagiellonian dynasty's union expanded Poland's influence across Central Europe as a whole. Historically, that would be lots of sort of machinations revolving around the accumulation of further crowns at the same point. Like there would be rulers having the same crown, I don't know, of Hungary, Poland, Bohemia. And this was really typical of the era. And again, it was typical of monarchs that were, again, not wielding power on this. Imagine the enormity of these lands, right? The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as you know, in political territorial terms, was a veritable juggernaut, but obviously the social fabric was, as military power, was mostly, again, the product of this immensity concentrated in very sort of contained spaces at the time. Was mostly like a qualitative struggle against softer enemies overall, as the Ottomans, especially as they stretched out their strategic and logistical capacities in this northeastern frontier, and having problems even against the Germans later with the Swedes and so on. So it's complicated, and again, this is not to say that they weren't a great power, but first of all, at this point we are in the beginning. But when you see those huge maps, I made a video about that is titled Europa Jagiellonica, which is the Latin term for most of this Jagiellonian achievement. In fact, during the 15th century, accumulating multiple crowns at a time over this, again, immense territories, larger than, for example, what the Habsburgic Empire would be later, even by its end in 1918, as it had managed to partially preserve an enormous territory. And mostly the mechanism stemmed from not just the elitization of the monarchs, but especially the oligarchizations of the nobility. And so the fact that in these elective monarchies that were elective exactly because the state had failed, monarchs tried to impose themselves, given that they didn't have many means, against the nobility, all in a picture of general sort of lagging behind compared to what was happening in Western European power and state building. They, by marrying to one another, they would not just legitimize each other, but they would often inherit these crowns, so that if you would normally tend to rule from the more civilized place. And from there, even a relatively meager tribute that you could exact from the nobility, by the way, that would pay you hush money to not to intervene into their affairs, would be some sort of, for the individual country you were ruling from, some good amount of surplus to trying to build further like a monarchic power. That's also how, in general, some of these powers succeed to go on. Poland, again, is more successful than the others. Bohemia fails, basically. Hungary does too. But the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at large, also because of the weakness of its eastern neighbors and southern neighbors at some point, is more long-lasting and quite interesting to approach what's in that kind of lack of eastern frontier to a degree. That was not that easy to control, especially for powers like this that, as we've seen, were all already relatively faulty. The expansion of Polish influence across Central Europe facilitated the temporary vassalization of Moldavia, so gaining the upper hand for Poland on this region compared to Hungary. We are in the 40s of the 15th century. The placement of the Jagiellonians on the thrones of the same Hungary and Bohemia, that were, however, relatively ill-fated enterprises. Again, I made that video about Casimir the Fourth. That is mostly the high point of this. In 1440, Vladislav III, that was Jogaila's son, was crowned King of Hungary, leveraging Polish-Lithuanian military support to secure his claim against rival factions. It bolstered Polish-Lithuanian military and administrative authority in Ukraine. This is, by the way, after the Teutonic Knights had been essentially almost disposed of, or at least redimensioned in power. After the Battle of Tannenberg, the Poles had also gained much greater ground on the Baltic, which was their old ambition, given that the Vistula Valley resources at that point had to pass under the yoke of the Germans in order to be exported across the Baltic. So there's also the issue of Danzig. It remains a German city, but under the Polish, because in theory, remember, the Teutonic Knights as a whole were subjects to the Polish crown, but obviously had at least acquired a much different posture until the Battle of Grunwald, in fact. This Polish extension, however, also intensified social and religious tensions in Ukraine already by introducing Polish royal castles and officials that were naturally pressuring and lording over the Ruthenian majority and enabling Catholic Polish magnates to acquire vast estates in the process, often at the expenses not just of the Ruthenian nobles and gentry, but also the Lithuanians, that, as we've seen, had partially infiltrated this territory. This shows, of course, how Poland had been gaining momentum compared to all these other powers, and how this would immediately trigger some issues, especially as we just explained, considering that the say southeastern Ukraine was at large very difficultly reachable by Polish sort of conventional forces that were very far away from here. And there, in fact, some Ukrainian power would sort of consolidate, regardless, of course, of the one that still existed within central Western Ukraine, a more also civilized direction under the Poles and the Lithuanians. After Poland reclaimed Danzig from the Teutonic Order, where in 1455, it engaged more extensively in Baltic trade, particularly in grain. Grain was largely produced by Poland, that, as we've seen, had pretty strong demographic backbone at this point, having come out relatively unscathed from the Black Death. This is also a time in history towards the Renaissance in which tendentially European countries start to become ever more interconnected with one another in terms of, for example, trade, grain exports. This grains arrived from up to England and Portugal. So everything was very economically relevant for the Polish rulers. The 13 Years' War, 1454-1466, culminating in the second phase of Torun, which granted Poland the control over Danzig for good and its custom duties as well, generating extra significant revenue from grain exports. With investments from Western European merchants, Polish nobles developed large latifundia in Western Ukraine, so the Rus Czerwona, which means the red Ruthenia. And again, this was the Ruthenian Palatinate. It was the most prestigious. Would be Western Volhynian mostly. That's where they expanded. Naturally, Ukraine was an overwhelmingly agricultural country and had historically, again, exported grain for many times. Even the Byzantine Empire had relied on the Pontic steppe for that, and the ties with the Kievan Rus in part still kept alive that deal. Now, as we've seen, things got more gravitating around Poland. So this Polish nobility could simply move the grain from the southeastern to the northwestern frontier producing grain in Ukraine and exporting it down the Vistula to Danzig. This was very convenient, even from a logistical point of view, and it greatly enhanced, also, regardless of this sort of burdening ties, the Western Ukrainian connection to the rest of Europe. This, however, led to the gradual enserfment of the peasantry, formalized by the 1588 Third Lithuanian Statute, which eliminated peasants' tenants' rights to relocate. It's not like in Ruthenia or in Lithuania, or frankly even in Poland to an important degree, peasants had ever had this overwhelming liberty, right? The Polish Szlachta considered Polish peasants like dirty animals to enslave and, essentially not human beings. And this is absolutely Polish and at the utmost of its identity throughout all its history. It's difficult to properly express the radical separation on the basis of societal ties and estates hierarchy from the Szlachta that literally considered themselves Sarmatian in this, at least, Renaissance classicizing Iranian ideal of origins compared to the Slavic peasantry. So this is also for the people who always whine about their nationalistic connection. Realize that if you were a lesser people, like you would have definitely been by majority in that world, the nobility would think that you were a dirty animal, and actually would have not really been that far from the truth. There is, again, a level of shockingly traumatic brutality that only perhaps like the Muscovy or the Mongols at Similia had towards lesser people. And again, this is a completely different mentality from the West, where, as you know, it's not like the peasants were considered particularly highly, but never in the brutally disproportionate fashion that exists in this lands. I mean, in Central Europe, even in Germany, like most people are somebody else's people. There isn't properly the concept of, citizenry, or there is a heavily rigid and solidly hierarchical sense of superiority and inferiority of human beings, with an incredibly categorical divide in between. So this is really Central Europe in its purest identity. If you were to pick properly, the purest identity of Central Europe is how much lesser people the peasantry and practically anyone who is not a count or a bishop really is. This powerfully impresses probably the entire mindsets of these people to this very day, right? And it's incredibly important to stress because, again, Europeans are very similar, but also very different along these patterns, and nobody talks about this stuff, right? Which is by far the most important that you can highlight at a societal and cultural level throughout this period. The manorial economy's expansion also impacted Eastern Ukraine, though in a distinct and naturally more shaded manner. The region's sparser population made serfdom harder to enforce, which, as often happened, does not derive from actually any particularly better life quality of these people, right? Just like people say, in Finland there wasn't feudalism, there was actually just free peasantry because free peasantry because there was nothing to develop anything from, and so you were, say, relatively free, even though traditionally and mentally you were not even literally being considered so, mostly as a broader mob community in at the fringes of the civilized or better of the uncivilized world, where you would literally like live in an underdeveloped and backward lifestyle, even compared to places like Sweden, right, that were not really sparking for particular socioeconomical advancement, while the rest of Europe was overwhelmingly more advanced and had peasants who lived much better than you, individually speaking, and not really and partaking to much more cohesive political and social realities than this alleged special nature vibing kind of fringe of the world, right? And unfortunately, paranoia and alienation from reality are things that people in the harshest conditions still live in a burst, and regardless of in this sense, what they formally count on in terms of development of an entire country. So if you don't understand this harshness, you can never understand the history of Northeastern Europe by any stretch of the imagination. And there is nothing, again, romantic or heroic about that. When you look at the distance, for example, of eastern Ukraine from the Vistula, you realize that cattle ranching, supplemented by income from taverns, mills, tolls, and duties on hunting and fishing, were more practical for landlords, so some local exploitation and a lesser connection with the rest of the more advanced markets. These were not the best lands where you could settle as a Polish or Lithuanian nobleman. And if you got there, you did that at your risk in many ways, in this sort of far eastern frontier. Because it will be really risky to live there, considering the people who also live from the other side and or in between. As a result, smaller folkwork manor farms predominated in the east, with less hierarchical presence, but yes, also less societal consistency. By the 1570s, eastern Ukraine's cattle trade was bolstered by the construction of fortified market towns, exactly to shield themselves from nomadic raiding at Semilia. Bratslav, for example, was one of these, serving as hub for exporting livestock to Central European markets if you could reach that. However, landlords' reliance on accessitors, tolls, and fees created a feudalizing effect on their relationship with peasants and lesser gentry, particularly as the landlords often held lifelong crown official appointments. I mean, it was already something somebody went there if you wanted to maintain the title as long as they survived. And so giving them essentially freer hand on the way they would administrate these places. That is to say, with increasing escalatory brutality just to maintain control. The availability of uncolonized land allowed only a few magnates to amass vast latifundia through large crown land grants in exchange for similar commitments to settle and defend them. Right, so definitely not something particularly effective. Again, it's obvious that the districts would become larger, if anything, because they were just more difficult to control. And so paradoxically, like making it larger was, yes, a further problem, but at least you could have some minimal extra surplus that you could extract from these places if you, of course, more brutally infested them in some way. And you have, again, different layers of this. Western Central Ukraine, as we've seen, is more developed. In the 90s of the 16th century, Konstantin Ostroz'kyi, Palatine of Kiev, secured title to lands in Volhynia, Galicia, and Kiev itself, encompassing by himself roughly 1,300 villages, 100 towns, and 40 castles. This is the beginning of some sort of more, again, decentralized Ukrainian government that de facto, even just by the process of Ukrainization of the local Poles and Lithuanians, had obviously to take place. Because how do you control these lands anyway? Ostroz'kyi's estates were organized under a sophisticated administrative system with appointed stewards overseeing tax collection and defense, ensuring the economic viability of his holdings. He protected these territories with a private army of, however, 2,000 retainers, which, considering the vastity of, again, this lands, is actually pretty scarce. And yet comparable in size to the Crown Army in Ukraine. Because these territories, by that point, by the way, had become Polish, not Lithuanian anymore. And this had followed naturally also a gradual Polish colonization, process of Polonization in general, in the way we explained. And now we sort of stretch towards the end of the 16th century, so we will see better how these things had evolved. But the latter dynamic essentially these very powerful magnates locally that were essentially capable of taking over large amounts of the country with forces were comparable to the ones of the Polish crown, gives you the idea of the oligarchic level of privatization. It was historically typical, in fact, of Central and Eastern Europe, and especially of the latter. All right, so it's a mechanism really worth a big deal of attention, due not just to the importance of these lines, but the kind of actual dynamics that characterize them. All right, there is definitely a very strong level of general control with the within the same Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By the way, at this point, really had been formalized with an increasing subordination, in fact, also of this Ruthenian territory, not just the Lithuanian ones that had historically, as we've seen, had been shrinking because of the Polonization of, say, Ukraine. And so it's a vicious circle that will also bring to the lost opportunity of creating a way more solid Polish-Lithuanian Ukrainian Commonwealth that would have had naturally to be carefully balanced. And this is something that, especially in the 17th century, the Poles will fatally fail to achieve. So naturally, when you look at the stories, you understand how seminal the late medieval dynamics really were in the picture. And it's difficult to relate these countries to such times, even though the Middle Ages remained so close to them up to literally the last century, our last century, which makes you really think about the closeness of those times, of course, to us, but also how habitual, for example, for certain lands, these dynamics were, even in the recognition of each other's cultural and ethnic divides. And therefore making you understand much better how and why certain dynamics with broader, contemporary developments of these lands would actually occur. And you can explain lots of these dynamics, of course, through lots of other things that actually happened in these centuries that intensified the contrast, but also favored, in a sense, the further enucleation and emergence of those political identities. Again, the national once existed, and then there is the nationalistic take. There's another thing, but that you can appreciate also in that perspective. In fact, that's really the point, for which it is difficult to discuss even certain topics in 20th century history, because people tend to just slam, let's say, certain, for example, fights for independence, given the certain particular political connotations of the time, as if there wasn't actually a good reason for that kind of independentistic movement. And again, regardless of which side you really were. And again, these are complicated histories, but also, as you understand, incredibly relevant ones, incredibly actual ones. So it's all something worth documenting and staying tuned to, like in these videos, in as much as they really explain great part of the world that we see today as well, and that many people are unwilling basically to accept. Again, you get the past history, you really get everything out of that. And people having said this habit of flattening, saying, "I don't know, before nothing happened," right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. There wasn't this country or whatever. if you know literally the ABC of it, you just know that that narrative is diametrically opposite from the truth, exactly because reality aligns with it, and history tells that pretty clearly. So that's why I like making these videos, because they really widen that perspective and they allow you to maintain also a higher level of objectivity. Besides, I really needed this video because it glues together many different polities, talks also about some that we haven't quite discussed, so I can easily imagine which kind of topics, comment links I will have to put in this. And that's what I also hope for Schwerpunkt, that these videos are able to glue together so many different periods and lands. I should create a site where I get, I don't know, the map of a country, and then I don't know, like in this center, in this other, and I can attach sort of YouTube videos links to that to really show you how much you can look at certain countries through history, through Schwerpunkt alone. Unfortunately, the suggestive mechanism here doesn't work, right? For example, I wouldn't like to say, but yesterday I made that video about the British military reforms post-Fontenoy with Howe's, enactment in the U.S. War of Independence. That was a hell of a video, right? That deserves several hundreds views in a day. And for some reason, people, like, you understand how, right, this is not really a topic that is discussed. This is truly a historical study of British doctrine in the Northern American theater as a continuity of the connection with the old world one. It's all tied into the Enlightenment era of warfare, the age of Frederick the Great and other leaders. No views. You make a video about the migration era, everybody watches. Right? This is really depressing because it makes you realize that there's just a minimal fraction of the subscribers that has the palest idea of what it means to have really like a historical compass, and also probably like a historical education, given that we all know that nobody teaches these topics, right? So it's not like they're unimportant. So you must explain at some point why you do. I bet that, I don't know, all the worst things, like the views on the video about the Hebrew infantrymen was just connected to people hoping that I would talk bad about the Jews, or I don't know, if I talk about something also in the thumbnail that looks provocative, people click on it. It's silly, all right? I make the videos and with my specific background, whereby I have an objective and accurate understanding of why these topics are relevant and important, compared and how they are compared to one another. So witnessing to this is not really, say, positive. Let's put it in this way. And it's a pity for you, because you have this content for free. You would have to search this in basically nowhere, because it's not just original, but it's integrated with the rest. So it's literally something that you can accept only if you stick to the premise of having a comprehensive strategic education. And unfortunately, that's, in fact, what most people don't even care about. And it's always, unfortunately, been kind of weird. And again, I understand it's the time of the year most people are at the beach right now, but there is also something wrong in a general sense with the views distribution between each video. It can't be sort of forgotten. Here I realized that, yes, I made a Polish history, because it's mostly, I don't know how to frame this video, by the way. Like central, yeah, medieval history, whatever, yes. But I I don't know whether we can speak of probably Polish history for this video. I was checking that playlist. That has 34 videos, and we haven't uploaded very much. It got a fair amount of views. And I don't know, we should make more videos about Polish history, because we have been also being relatively thorough about, I don't know, Balkan polities, even the aforementioned Vlachs at some point we have to do it, but this bigger states, also with Hungary, we should be a bit more substantial. However, I created a very sort of, by title at least, erratic playlist titled Medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe, which sort of doesn't mean much. I mean, it's more like, it's one of the very first playlists that I created, and I still had that kind of idea of approximation of Eastern Europe in a broader sense, not narrow one I use today. But this playlist was watched by so many people historically, and it still does get watched in that way. So again, this video will go straight there. I hope it gets more views than the average, because I expect a video like this to normally, depending on how I market it, naturally in title and thumbnail, because again, yeah, it's not about the almost 2 hours long lesson. It must be, about, the pictures. Like, let's not digress on this. Let's not prefer certain words, but again, it's a very important picture we want to draw together, and hopefully we're succeeding. The channel has ups and downs, mostly due to, again, if I make a video criticism of another channel, I get immediately thousands of views. But it is despicable to a degree, because I have things to say. It's not like interesting because there is drama in criticizing other people's videos. It's so silly. Like, just, I have 28,000 subscribers. Like, if there was a concerted effort for this channel to skyrocket, it could happen overnight, right? And this seems instead that, again, this shows that there's probably an inertia, a wanted inertia. I've been telling this stuff for a long time, and unfortunately it doesn't seem like people understand very much. But at least I have a core of fidelized subscribers that really stick around, that they do their job, and I don't have to ask anything in that way. So again, let's mostly follow that path. For the rest, it's what it is. Very well. Again, let's hope to make more, and let's also hope that there is a bit of a greater sensitivity to these topics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.